Hello, hello. I have one viewer. Hello, one viewer. Oh, now I have two. Hello, two viewers. It's getting real now, isn't it? So technically, this is a review for Unit 5, but of course, this is also the day before the AP exam. So you may want to review something totally different than Unit 5, and that's fine. This is a free fire zone, which means just feel free to ask me anything you want to ask me. I do not need to start with going over an FRQ today because I've already gone over the other FRQ each time in each of the 4 other review sessions. So if you have not seen the other review sessions, they are on my YouTube channel, the 4 other ones. And then, of course, there's the unit reviews that are an hour long of each unit that I've done before. So I hope my washing machine's going right now. It's sounds kind of loud in here, but I hope you can hear me just fine. So it's a pretty simple plan here. I am just here. I can be here an hour, and I'm here to just answer any last minute cram questions you want to ask me. So feel free to put it in the chat box. There's no question that's off base, so you can ask me about any unit. Okay. So PACs. PACs were created as a means to, this is traditional. Okay, so there's 2 types of PACs. PAC stands for Political Action Committee, and they are a vehicle for funneling money into elections to influence elections. Okay. Traditional PACs were a way to filter money that was moving from mainly corporations and unions into elections, but you weren't allowed to contribute directly to a candidate's campaign. Remember, any money after the Federal Election Reform Act of 1975, any money going directly to the candidate is called hard money. Hard money. And it must be reported to the Federal Elections Commission, the FEC, quarterly. And there are limits on how much people can give to candidates as hard money. It's like $2,400, $2,700 now. And so PACs were not allowed to give money directly. Corporations and unions were not allowed to give money directly to candidates as hard money. They had to form PACs. And then executives would get bonuses, and they would then contribute up to $5,000 to PACs. And then that money would be funneled, reported, and there were limits on how much could be given to each candidate as hard money. So those are traditional PACs. Traditional PACs, are corporate and union money. There are limits on it, and it goes to the candidates and is reported by the FEC. And yeah, so those are traditional PACs. Super PACs form after the Citizens United case. And they basically function without any limits and usually are dedicated to a specific candidate and helping to get that candidate to win. But here's the catch. The super PAC gives, this is the super PAC, this is the candidate. The super PAC does not give the money to the candidate at all. No. In fact, there's supposed to be this wall between the super PAC and the candidate. The super PAC after Citizens United is basically like a corporate body, which is considered to be just like people, because the Citizens United case ruled that corporations are people, and therefore spending money on elections is free speech. And therefore this corporation called the super PAC for Bernie or Hillary or Trump or whatever super PAC. Bernie doesn't have a super PAC actually because he doesn't believe in them, but that they can spend that money however they want to influence the election. They just can't actually coordinate with the campaign directly about what the super PAC is doing. So Under super PACs now, they're supposed to be the candidate and their hard money campaign they're running. And then this super PAC over here also trying to help this person win, but not coordinating with this person at all. Those are super PACs. So super PACs and traditional PACs are actually pretty different from each other. Super PACs came about as a result of the Citizens United ruling. All right, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is one of the two ways that the government tries to affect the economy. Fiscal policy is the way in which, remember that capitalism, unregulated, creates booms and busts. Okay, it's like a roller coaster and it's really uncomfortable. And also keep in mind the basic premise that there's always the same amount of money in the economy. Theoretically, it's just how fast it's moving. Okay, and if the money gets moving too fast, it can feel like we've increased the money supply, and so inflation will go up. And there's two ways that you can try and solve that problem. One is monetary policy, the other is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the original kind of idea. It said that through taxing and spending, adjusting taxing and spending, you can flood money into the economy or you can pull money out of the economy. It's called Keynesian economics. Okay, that's called Keynesian economics. And what it means is when the economy is going really, really fast and it looks like it's in a boom cycle, you need to suck money out of the economy. Okay, Amy, I got you. You got to suck money out of the economy, and the way you do that is by raising taxes and lowering government spending. And that's up to the Congress to pass the budget and the president to pass it. Okay, that's done by Congress and the president are the governmental institutions that do fiscal policy. Okay. Meanwhile, if the economy is real sluggish, it's moving too slow, you can infuse money into the economy by lowering taxes and increasing government spending. And so that was considered to be the way in which you could impact the economy through fiscal policy. Okay? All right. The Great Depression, Civil Rights, expand government commerce power. Okay. Big. The Great Depression, for those of you who are sophomores who haven't taken American history too, this is where you can be at a little bit of a disadvantage. The Great Depression established all of these huge federal programs that had not existed before that were intended to help with the public welfare. Probably the most famous example is Social Security. Social Security, before the Great Depression and during the Great Depression, there were all these old people who had no money, and they actually, a lot of them were frail and elderly and couldn't work or would not be hired because they were old. And so they were like starving in their beds because they didn't have any retirement savings. So Social Security was started as a like forced pension plan where the federal government takes money out of your bank, out of your paycheck month in, month out, and then provide you a retirement pension when you get old. That's a pretty big power, right? And it was couched and justified through the commerce power. And that's just one example. Another example would be like the minimum wage was established during the Great Depression through the commerce power. The Securities and Exchange Commission was founded as a result of the stock market crash during the Great Depression, justified under the commerce power. So those would just be three examples of how the federal government grew in its power as a result of the Great Depression. The Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also expanded government under the commerce power because, if you recall, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that we can't discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, or sex. And they specifically meant if any institutions receive federal funds, that those institutions will not continue to be able to practice discrimination in those ways. So that's an example of fiscal federalism, where if you're a public university system, for example, and you have discrimination as part of your practices, then the federal government will withhold your research money and grants that could go to support special programming or whatever at your university. Okay. And that was all justified under the commerce power as well. So, and fiscal federalism. Okay. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is partly upheld by institutions because they don't want to lose their access to federal funding or to getting federal contracts to do work for the federal government. Okay. All right. The McGovern Commission came after the Democratic National Convention of 1968. And it was at that convention in Chicago where there were a whole bunch of young anti-war protesters and civil rights activists who wanted access to the nomination process of the Democrats. And basically, there were a bunch of old white men in the convention because the processes that the party had created to seat delegates at the convention basically made access to seasoned politicians and people of privilege had an advantage in navigating those systems. And so after the 1968 election, they decided to make the Democratic Convention and the Democratic Party in general more accessible to young people and less privileged people, and to get kind of back to their grassroots. A specific example would be when we organized my precinct, 0808, here in Harrington Grove neighborhood, our president, whatever gender or race they are, the vice president can't be the same gender or race. So it ensures diversity in the party. And then all the people who are in the precincts and are precinct officers can run to be delegates at the convention. And since the people who can run are more diverse, the people who can be seated at the convention are more diverse. Okay, so the McGovern Commission was basically trying to allow more access by the common people to the party structures that are involved in the convention nomination platform writing process. And then that was mirrored by the Republicans to some degree. So ever since 1968, if you look at the people sitting in the Democratic Convention every 4 years, they're a much more diverse group of people. That also made it necessary for them to form superdelegates, if you recall, because they weren't quite sure they could trust the common people to pick someone electable. So that's the role the superdelegates play at the convention. Okay, a trustee versus instructed delegate versus politicos. These are ways in which elected officials decide how they're going to vote. Those who are trustees have this idea that they were elected and the people trust their judgment, and they will use their own best judgment when deciding how to vote, period. Okay? Instructed delegates feel that they represent their constituents, and they're more likely to take a poll or ask their constituents at a town hall how they feel about things, and then vote in a way that they feel is representative of their district, in the case of a House member, or their state, in the case of a Senate member. A politico is super pragmatic about these things, and they say, well, the people care about some things, they don't care about other things. So a politico says if the issue is not highly salient, which means it's highly detailed, it's not very well understood, the people don't really care about it, it's not on the public's mind, then they vote their conscience, what they think is best. If, though, the issue is highly salient, which means that the people are paying attention and care a lot about it, then they will vote in a way that represents the majority of their district. So they're kind of pivot based on the issue, whether they are trustees or instructed delegates. That's a politico. Okay. Different categories of money. M1, M2, so on. I don't know what that is. M1, M2. Maybe some kind of graphic you're looking at or something. I just am not sure what that's a reference to. I'm sorry. Judicial consequences. Well, let's see. That's pretty broad. Judicial consequences could be, I would think, all the things that the judicial branch can do. Like, they can have a holding in a case that established precedent. They can offer an injunction, which says basically you have to stop doing something. They can remand something back to an earlier court to deal with. So to me, that's like, what are the things that can happen as a result of judicial action? And also then you have a stare decisis, which is they let the decision of a lower court stand. So I think those are the judicial consequences that I can think of off the top of my head. Okay, the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1975-ish established the idea that we would have some regulations on campaign finance. It said that we would, first of all, define hard money as money that goes directly to candidates. We would limit how much individuals could donate to candidates through hard money. We would report it. There would be a new agency founded in the election in the federal government called the Federal Election Commission, the FEC. It also tried to encourage public funding of campaigns to lower the amount of influence that money has on campaigns. So the FERA said that if you're running in the primary for president, that the federal government would match every dollar you raised. So you would need to raise less dollars, and therefore you would be less bought by special interests. Then if you won the nomination of either the Republican or the Democratic Party, you would get your campaign fully funded by the taxpayers who donate money to a special fund on their taxes. That method of funding campaigns was kind of the standard until around 2000, when it became clear that you could raise more money independently than through the FEC matching fund. So very few people take the government's money anymore to run for president. Buckley versus Valeo was the famous court case that said that it kind of defined, it said rich people can fund their own campaigns in an unlimited way. Okay, because once it said you could only, hard money, individual contributions to campaigns was limited to like $2,700. Then the question was, well, can you give your own campaign more than $2,700? And they ruled you could, because the way you spend your money is a free speech expression. And therefore you should, as a candidate who's rich, have an unlimited ability to spend money on your own campaign as an extension of your free speech. So Buckley-Valeo partly is what combines campaign spending with speech issues, First Amendment issues. All right, and then we had the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BICRA, and it was passed around 2000. And it said that the biggest takeaway from it, I think, is that it tried to limit independent spending that could happen 60 days before an election to try and influence the election. And it said you couldn't, private money or private organizations could not create ads or spend money to influence elections during that window. It led to the Citizens United ruling, because if you remember that a private group called Citizens United made a documentary about Hillary that was ruled illegal under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And that led to Citizens United versus FEC, where they ruled that corporations are people and they also have free speech rights through campaign spending, and therefore they can make whatever kind of media they would like through their First Amendment rights right up until the day of the election. Okay, so that's just a quick rundown. The budget process, the GAO and the OMB. Okay, the budget process starts with the president. He has an agency within the executive branch called the Office of Management and Budget. And that office drafts the president's priorities into a budget and delivers it to Congress in late January, early February. Then the Congress receives it with whatever amount of attention they would like to give it. Okay, if the president and the Congress are all aligned from the same party, it might get more attention than usual. If the president and the Congress are both houses not aligned with the president, then they might just ignore the whole thing. Then they begin the budget process with both the House and the Senate will draft budgets. They start with what's called a continuing resolution, which is how much are we resolving to spend this year. Then they might have to do authorization to create new programs. Remember, I talk about this. When I talk about this, I talk about buckets. Okay. So pretend like each part of the federal government or agency of the federal government that it needs funding has a bucket sitting out on a huge ground. Each time they create a new bucket, it requires an authorization bill. Okay. If there's a bucket that already exists because that has already been authorized, then it will need funding for the next year. So first they do a continuing resolution. Then if there's any new programs that are going to be founded, they have to authorize them. Then they start a process called appropriations, where they start just dropping money into buckets that cannot exceed the total amount of spending that they resolved under the resolution. Then the House and the Senate will both draft documents about how we're going to do that. Eventually, they have to go to conference committee where they get down to just one budget, which can then be passed. Now, the CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. Any proposals that are made about the budget, they score them to see how much that will actually cost. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, are like the accountants who actually try and predict how much different policy options are going to cost, how much money different tax revenue bills will bring in. It's called scoring, to make sure that we have an honest best guess on how these policies will actually play out fiscally. Okay. We also have an agency within the Congress called, in addition to the CBO, which does that, the GAO, the General Accounting Office. And they are the part of the agency within Congress that makes sure that all the parts of the government are spending the money the way it's supposed to be spent. I think of the GAO as kind of like the General Auditing Office, because they hold people accountable to spend money the way it's supposed to be spent. Once the budget has had a conference committee and both House and Senate have passed it, it goes on to the president, where the president has to also sign the budget, okay, to pass the budget. All right, the responsible party model is this whole idea that, and it works a lot better in Europe than it does here, that like the party has a platform and then you put them into office and then theoretically they do those policies and then you see how they work and you hold them responsible for those policy choices. The problem is the responsible party model doesn't work very well in the United States because, first of all, we can have people like Donald Trump or any other candidate that just like has not been in the party for long, just kind of like show up out of the woods, win the nomination, and then not actually have a lot of fidelity between what they want to do and the party. So, for example, the Republican Party supports free trade, and Donald Trump likes tariffs. So he doesn't even represent his party. So you can't really use the Trump presidency to hold the Republican Party responsible for their policy choices because there's not a fidelity. There's not a lot of fidelity between the candidates always and their party. So there's just not always alignment. The Down model and the rational choice model are kind of the same things as I understand them. What it's saying is that we don't have, because of the winner-take-all system in American politics, particularly in the electoral college and the election of the president, it forces us to have two parties, okay? Because you've got to get the majority of the votes in the electoral college, which means 270 of the 538. The way you do that is you have to win 51% of the vote in a state to get those electoral votes. If we had multiple parties, no one would ever get to 51% of the vote, and the electoral college could not select the president because no one would get to 270 electoral votes. So then the presidency would always be determined by the House of Representatives, which is not a very democratic thing to do because it's only 50 votes. Because remember, in the House of Representatives, if the president has to be selected by the House, each state only gets one vote. So obviously, we can only have two parties because only by having two parties is somebody going to get to 51% of the vote in each state and to 51% of the electoral votes in the electoral college. So we only have two parties, which means that you have your far left, you have your far right, you have all these swing voters in the middle. And every election, basically during the primary, the two parties have to try and pick up their most ardent supporters who are like the most partisan people. But then for the general election, they have to swing to the middle and try and attract those swing voters. And that means it's just rational that our policy choices will be pretty moderate. Okay. In the general election, the Republicans and the Democrats are basically fighting for the same swing voters. Okay. That's why in this particular election, or in the last election, people have thought that Bernie Sanders should not get the nomination because he's unelectable, because he is really far out here and may not be able to pick up these swing voters in the middle. Whereas Joe Biden would be a rational choice because he would pick up some swing voters in the middle. And so that helps explain, one, why we don't have multiple parties, because of the winner-take-all system. Two, why in the primaries, the candidates are fairly extreme, or try to appeal to their most extreme elements. But why we don't have radical parties. We don't have a communist and socialist and fascist parties, because the general election, you have to move to the middle. Okay. All right, Emmy wants to know what sequestration is. Sequestration was this like punishment to try and get themselves to like hold hands and make a decent budget. Sequestration was part of the 1980s Reagan, not McCain-Feingold. Yeah, McCain-Feingold. Where if we didn't control spending, then we were going to cut all agencies across the board by like 10%. That was called sequestration. I've talked about it, like, instead of, ideally when you do the budget, you should do it through normal order and committee process, where you like do surgery on the budget and you make rational cuts in places that need cutting. Well, sequestration is the opposite of that. It's like if you wanted to lose weight, instead of doing surgery to like remove little pieces of fat on that body to try and lose weight, it's just like cutting the head off. Okay, that's what sequestration is supposed to be like. And it's supposed to be an incentive to get people to do the regular budget, so we don't have to do these across the board cuts to try and cut the size of government. But it really didn't work. Like, we went through a couple cycles of sequestration, and it didn't actually incentivize elected leaders like it was supposed to arrive at a budget. Impoundment. Impoundment was when Nixon was president. He was working with a majority Democrat Congress, and they started authorizing all of these new programs and setting aside all this spending. And he would approve the budget because there were things in the budget he liked, and then he just wouldn't spend the money on the things he didn't like. He would just hold the money and not tell the Treasury to spend it the way it's supposed to be spent. And then he would only spend the parts of the money that for programs he actually supported. And this is called impoundment. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional, that as a part of executing and faithfully executing the law, that the president does have to spend the money in the budget as directed. He cannot hold the money. Okay. Fiscal cliffs are when the budget has not been passed and the debt ceiling needs to be raised, or we're going to default on our debts as a nation, which has never happened since Hamilton was president, theoretically. Not since Hamilton was our first Secretary of the Treasury under Washington. Hamilton was never president, sorry. And then the idea is that the president and the Congress, for whatever reason, might be divided government or something like that. They can't agree on a budget. So the debt ceiling, we're going to default on it. And that would be very, very bad. And so we are heading off a fiscal cliff and having a government shutdown or defaulting on our debt because there is an agreement. And so those fiscal cliffs are times that really force the institutions of government and the Congress and the presidency to try and come up with an agreement, because a debt ceiling crisis or a government shutdown can affect them all negatively. So we kind of now don't typically go through the normal budget process anymore because our institutions are fairly dysfunctional due to polarization and gridlock. And so these fiscal cliffs are like the new crisis that forces these institutions to try and do something. All right. Okay, so the nomination process. There's the old way we used to do the nomination process, which was like political machines and party leaders who would meet in back rooms and through caucuses and pick our candidates. And then around 1900, did the progressive movement, there was this idea that party members should have a greater role in picking who their nominee is going to be to run for president for the party. And that's when more states started changing their laws to have primaries. Remember that how this is done is totally decided by the states under the 10th Amendment. Okay. So more states moved from a caucus system to a primary system, which means that the party members on a certain day, usually in the spring, will go vote for who they want to represent their party in the general election in the fall, in even years every fourth year. So the states go out and do that and elect delegates through the primary. The primary election assigns delegates to go to the national convention. Each state gets a certain number of delegates at the convention. This is all decided by the party, by the way. This is where the parties make these decisions. The Democrats have the largest convention, it has like 4,000 people at it. The Republicans have a smaller convention, it has about 2,500 people at it. The different delegates there are pledged to vote for candidates, and the candidate that gets the magic number of delegates pledged to them automatically becomes the nominee at the convention. And so the conventions have largely now become very predictable, and it's known already before the convention starts who has the most delegates, the proper number of delegates to become the nominee for the party. And so unlike before, particularly after 1968, I will say, the McGovern-Fraser situation again really tightened this up. So definitely since 1968, increasingly the National Convention is much more scripted and well known who the nominee is going to emerge from the party convention. Okay. Oh my. We have some really interesting questions coming up here, don't we? Obviously, some people have a lot of time on their hands. Alrighty, let me clean up the house here a little bit. And then I'll get on to our next serious question. Okay, I think that goes back to Jana. Yes. All right. Iron triangles. Okay. So remember that iron triangles are between the bureaucrats. I'm going to do it the way I do in class. I'm going to get this at this point. So, but the question isn't backwards. Okay. We have the interest groups, the elected officials, and bureaucrats. Okay. And the way an iron triangle can work positively. Okay. It's called an issue network, then, if we're being all optimistic and like Madisonian. What it basically says is we got these elected officials. They're generalists, not specialists. And they need help gaining all the information they need to be an informed, enlightened leader. Okay. So these interest groups know a lot about specific policies. So they will lobby and provide information to the elected official who is a generalist. Okay. And then once the official gets that information, with the help of also the bureaucracy, they can create enlightened policy that is highly, like, according to the bureaucrats, it would be highly administratable. Okay. The that's the positive part of iron triangles. Remember too, though, that they can also be negative. So in the case of like a liberal, and then they take on another name, iron triangles or subgovernments, where you could have a liberal one. So let's go through a liberal one, and then we'll go through a conservative one. Okay, a liberal one would be like the interest group is always seeking greater funding, spending, government regulation, enlarging the scope of government. So the elected official wants to woo these interest groups because these interest groups will give them campaign money and will also electioneer for them. Also, the bureaucrats want also to have larger budgets, so the bureaucratic agency can like get bigger and more powerful, and the bureaucrats within it have more authority. So that's a liberal iron triangle where it leads to hyperpluralism. Okay. Then you can have the conservative one. Okay. The conservative one would be where you don't want regulation. An interest group might be like a corporate entity. They don't want regulation or the government to actually do its job. So as a result, they lobby the legislator to basically be inactive. And again, that legislator wants campaign donations or support or electioneering. So then they can influence the bureaucracy to become like a captured agency where they put someone in the top of it that won't actually regulate or like meet the mission of the bureaucratic agency. Usually in that case, it would be a regulatory agency. Okay. So those are two different types of situations. Both issue networks, which means positive, and then the negative version, both liberal and conservative. All right, so super PACs of 527 groups. All right, 527 groups were founded after BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, as a way to get around some of the spending restrictions. And 527 groups are just interest groups that register through the IRS. And they're not supposed to, in their advertisements and stuff that they do in election times, they're not supposed to tell you like who to vote for or campaign directly for a candidate. Instead, they're just supposed to give information. Okay. And that was supposed to keep them from being considered illegal by making ads within the 60-day window. But increasingly, 527 groups were kind of campaign related. Like instead of saying, vote for Kay Hagan's opponent, okay, they would say, Kay Hagan has done these terrible things. Call Kay Hagan and tell her to quit doing these terrible things. Okay. That's the kind of ad a 527 group would put out. And so while it didn't say vote for Kay Hagan's opponent, it would basically give you a negative impression of Kay Hagan. She was our senator in North Carolina at a time when 527 groups were popular. And that would allow that 527 group to influence elections, but still not break the laws under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, because technically they weren't campaign ads, they were information ads. Okay. We're not really seeing that many 527s anymore because after Citizens United, the super PAC thing is just so easy. Like, you don't really need to create all of these complicated little tax vehicles who have to jump through all these hoops to influence elections without acting like they're influencing elections. Okay. Okay. Formal and informal powers of the president. Great. All right, so some formal powers of the president. These are the ones, the formal powers are the ones that are talked about in the Constitution in Article 2. Yes, Article 2. Okay, so first and foremost, the president can sign laws or veto laws. Okay, the pocket veto is also outlined in the Constitution, so it is a formal power of the president. The president can make appointments. Okay, can appoint people to run the departments, is what it says. Remember, however, that those appointments have to be approved by the Senate in the advise and consent power. The president can appoint judges also as a part of the advise and consent power. The president can negotiate treaties, but those treaties also must be approved by the Senate in the advise and consent power. Okay. Negotiate treaties. Faithfully execute the law. Yeah. Foreign policy. Those are the main things. Okay. Then we have the president's informal powers, which are things that have kind of innovated. One is like the use of the bully pulpit, as technology has given the president, excuse me, more ability to communicate through mass communication. The use of the bully pulpit. Oh, another formal power is to give a State of the Union report on a yearly basis. But the bully pulpit is informal. It's when the president tries to like garner attention through media. The president's executive agreements. That's when the president, if you recall, with a foreign leader will be like, hey, as long as you and I are in power, we're going to do it this way without actually negotiating a treaty. That is an informal power. Executive orders are an informal power. Both executive agreements and executive orders can be undone by Congress passing a statute that specifically goes against that. They can also be overturned. The executive order can be overturned by the Supreme Court. So those are examples of informal powers of the president. Are there any others? I'm thinking. Oh, the signing statement. The signing statement is when the president, when he's signing a bill, which is a formal power, he makes a little comment about how he's going to interpret the bill or how he's going to execute it. And it might be in alignment with the way Congress was thinking, or it might be different than the way Congress was thinking. And if they don't like his interpretation of what he says during his signing statement, they can pass a statute specifically clarifying what they want him to do. But until they do that, that signing statement approach will work, will be the way he executes the law. All right, so those are just some examples of informal powers of the president. Okay, monetary policy is the second way that the government can try and control for the boom and bust cycles of capitalism, and also try and keep the money from moving too fast through the economy, which leads to inflation, or money moving sluggishly through the economy, which is a recession. It helps them pull money out or push money into the economy. Okay, monetary policy is carried out by the Federal Reserve, which is a special regulatory agency created around 1913. It helps to print money, and it gets money out into the economy. By the way, the only person in the Federal Reserve that is appointed by the government is the Fed chair, and they're appointed by the president. Theoretically, that Fed chair should not be fired except with just cause, like all other regulatory agency heads. Okay. What the Fed chair and then the Fed does is they try to determine if inflation is going on. If inflation is peaking, then it means there's too much money in the economy, and the economy is moving too quickly, and there's going to be a boom. And that sounds good, but it's not good, because every boom leads to a bust, which is very painful. So what they do is start trying to suck money out of the economy. The way they do it is the Fed loans money to the banks, and the banks loan money to you. The amount of interest they charge to the banks is called the discount rate. And they raise the discount rate to make borrowing money more expensive. And that means the banks will raise the amount of money they charge you and your parents to borrow money. And that means people buy less stuff because they have less money. An example would be like your adjustable rate mortgage. If you have an adjustable rate mortgage for your house payment actually goes up when the Fed raises interest rates. So you literally have less dollars in your pocket because your house payment goes up. And that's how the federal government can suck money out of the economy and keep you from spending your money to buy a boat or whatever that will continue cycling through the system and cause inflation. Okay. The opposite side of monetary policy is if the economy is going too slow, as it was after 2008, and they want to push money through the economy, they can lower the discount rate, which means banks charge lower their rates, which means like people with adjustable rate mortgages, their house payment goes down, which means they have more money each month, which means they can go out to dinner, which means that'll help cycle money through the economy. So that is monetary policy. The other side of that is fiscal policy, and that's where supply-side economics comes into play. Fiscal policy is when you try to control the money circulating through the economy through taxing and spending policies. Okay. Before supply-side economics became popular again in the 1980s, we did Keynesian economics. And the idea was when the economy was too hot, you raise taxes, lower government spending, it'll suck money out of the economy. And when the economy is too slow, you lower taxes, increase government spending, and it will infuse money into the economy. Supply-side economics says don't do that, always lower taxes. And that will put money in people's pockets, grow the economy. And you should cut government spending. So always lower taxes, always lower government spending. And that will allow more people to keep their money, will encourage growth in the economy, create jobs, and that's the way that's supposed to work. The problem with supply-side economics is we're really good at cutting the taxes because that's easy to do politically. Everyone loves to have their taxes cut, so you can get reelected if you cut people's taxes. The hard part is cutting spending because it means you have to cut the military or Social Security and Medicare because those are the biggest spending items in the economy, in the budget. And that's really hard to do politically. So what we've been doing since 1980 largely is lowering taxes and keeping spending the same, and that's why we have a $22 trillion deficit. So supply-side economics has not proven to actually be very sustainable, but it's been super popular because because of we're ideologically conservative. We like the idea of small government and low taxes, but we're operationally liberal, which means we actually like our Medicare and Social Security and military. We just don't want to pay the high taxes to pay for them. Okay. So that's how supply-side economics has upended Keynesian economics. Shays Rebellion. Oh boy. Shays Rebellion was when we were under the Articles of Confederation period. And if you recall, the government was really not working. The federal government couldn't tax, it couldn't control trade between states. They couldn't amend the articles because all the states had to agree. It was very hard to pass a law. You had to have 9 of the 13 agree. We're just kind of in gridlock mess. Our government wasn't working. And nobody was really motivated to do much about that. For example, Madison invited a bunch of people to come try and fix the Articles of Confederation in Annapolis, and no one showed up. In the meantime, in Massachusetts, what was going on is that the rich were controlling the money supply, and they were underprinting money. Because if you have less of something, the stuff that exists of it is very valuable. So poor people couldn't get enough money to pay their debts, and they were losing their farms to banks. And the courts were adjudicating those losses. So in Massachusetts, the poor people decided that they would just burn down the courts, and then there would be no deeds to prove that they had lost their land. And this really, really scared our founding fathers because, of course, they owned a lot of property, and they wanted a really big goal of the founding fathers was to protect their property. So after Shays Rebellion heats up, and other similar rebellions heat up throughout the other states, including in North Carolina, in Virginia, it was called Bacon's Rebellion, and in North Carolina, it was called the Regulator Revolt. Suddenly, the founding fathers were super motivated to meet up and provide a federal government that was capable of putting down these rebellions. So Shays Rebellion and other rebellions were a huge incentive for our founding fathers to amend and ultimately throw out the articles and create a whole new government called the Constitution. All right, the impeachment process. So impeachment can happen to the president or to judges. And it basically means that you lose your job. You're removed from office. It doesn't mean that you go to jail or that you've been tried in the civil or criminal courts. Okay. So it's simply a political process to determine if you get to keep your government job. The charges are drawn up in the House, and then the trial is held in the Senate. And usually, as long as it's not the Chief Justice that's being tried, the Chief Justice comes over and runs the trial. In the Senate, you have to be found guilty by 2/3 vote to be removed from office. We've had 2 presidents impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Both were found not guilty in the Senate and kept their jobs. All right, any other questions? Steps of passing a bill. Okay. So, a bill can come from anywhere, like an interest group. ALEC bills comes from like a corporate interest group, individuals, legislators, the president, whatever. But they have to be kind of taken up by an elected member of the House or the Senate who becomes a sponsor of the bill. Once the bill has at least one sponsor, it needs to be introduced in either House of Congress, at which point it is assigned a number. Then the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader will send the bill to a committee, one of the standing or joint committees that exist. In committee, it could be further assigned to a subcommittee who will what's called mark up the bill, hear testimony about the bill from experts, talk to lobbyists who can provide them more insider information on the bill. At that point, they mark up the bill or change it. And then if it went to subcommittee, it can be taken to the full committee. The full committee can sit on the bill and never do anything with it, at which the bill dies. Or the committee can vote the bill out of committee, at which point it goes back to the Speaker or the Majority Leader, who can decide whether they ever want to take that bill to the floor for a floor vote by the entire body. It could also die there. It just might be that the House Speaker or the Majority Leader don't like the bill and they don't want to hold the vote. You can hold a special kind of vote where you try to push it out, force the Speaker or the Majority Leader's hand. And that is called a force petition, I think, where you force it to a vote. Very rare, though. Then if the bill, depending on if it starts in the House or the Senate, it can start in either one unless it's a revenue bill. If it's a revenue bill, which means a tax bill, it has to start in the House. If they pass that bill on either floor, then the bill goes to the other house, the Senate or House, where the whole thing repeats. Since the Senate has open debate, they very well could add amendments to that bill that started in the House, and now they have 2 different versions. Then they would have to go to a conference committee and come up with a single bill. Then that conference bill would have to go back to both houses to be passed by both houses. So the bottom line is you have to pass the exact same bill in both houses. And if a conference committee is needed to achieve that, you can do that. You can also just pass a bill in the House, and then the Senate gets that same bill, and they pass it in the exact same wording, and then you don't have a conference bill. Then if they both pass it, it goes to the President. The President can sign it. The President can sit on it for 10 days, and if Congress adjourns in that amount of time, then the bill just dies. Or the President can actively veto it. If the Congress can override his veto by 2/3 vote, then the bill can still become law. Okay? If it's a bill until it's passed by the President or overridden by 2/3 majority, and then it's called a law. Another word for a law is a statute. Okay? Judicial review is not in the Constitution, but is the power of the judicial branch to rule a statute, act, another word for statute is law, act as an action or decision of the executive, any member of the executive branch or Congress to be unconstitutional. Okay? So it's not just a law. It could be a decision of a bureaucratic agency. It could be an executive order. It could be lots of different things can be struck down through judicial review. Judicial review was declared as a power of the court by Marbury versus Madison in 1803. and it has stood as a fundamental constitutional principle ever since then that will not be overturned, because the only people who would overturn it would be the courts, and they won't take their own power from themselves. Judicial restraint is a judge who very, very much tries to never overturn precedent. They defer to precedent in almost all of their decisions. Judicial activism is the opposite of that. It's a judge who is okay with overturning precedent of other cases. Brown versus Board is an example of that, where they overturned precedent case law that had existed for almost from 1896 to 1954. They overturned it in a single case, and that was an example of judicial activism. Generally, trust in government over time was pretty favorable until Watergate and Vietnam and the publishing of the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. And then there became this sense of cynicism in the American electorate that you couldn't trust government, and we needed the media to be a watchdog on the government. And also, since Eisenhower gave his military-industrial complex speech where he warned the American people that the military and corporations who want fat government military contracts could conspire to grow the military in such a large way that it would almost bankrupt the country. Those kinds of things also have led to a decrease in trust in government over time, and we become more cynical and less trusting of government. That was really a shame, because at the same time that was happening, we established these social programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So in the 1960s, these Great Society programs, public housing, food stamps, that required government funding. And so our commitment to those programs has been somewhat compromised because of the cynical opinions we have about how efficient and capable government is of those functions. Our trust in government did pop up a little bit right after 9/11, as we kind of pulled together as a nation to focus on national security. But it's never really gone back to the same heights as, like, say, during the Great Depression and World War II, when the American people had, like, really, really strong faith in their government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a 4-term president. All right. We got about 2 minutes left. Boy, this time flies when we're having fun, right? Okay, with our last couple minutes, let me just really, really encourage you to do the following things. Get 8 hours of sleep. Do not get too little sleep. Eat a good breakfast, but don't eat anything weird that you don't normally eat. Check in with your first period teacher, and then head on to the multipurpose room. Take your time with the multiple choice. You have an incredible amount of time to analyze each question, so take advantage of that. And yes, you do have access to the giant Kahoot. It is linked off of my website, angelascioli.com. There's a link to it. Also, if you go to kahoot.com, it's public, and it's called AP GoPo Monster Review. Would you like me to post the link on Remind? I can do that. Okay. War coverage over time. Okay, I'll close out with that. So in our early wars, like World War II, there was no media access to the war front, and men in uniform were the reporters. There was heavy censoring of everything that we reported out. And in general, people felt that that was not indicative of a free society. So then the pendulum swung the other way, and by Vietnam, there was no limits on the press. And you had basically Dan Rather, like, running through the jungles of Vietnam, speaking directly to soldiers who were not very happy. And it was a living room war, they called it. And people sitting in their living rooms were shocked at the lack of morale in some of our troops. So by the first Iraq War in 90-ish, 1989-ish, they did what was called the Velvet Rope War, where they allowed the press to go near the war front and stand kind of at a distance, maybe 50 miles distance, and could see the bombs falling in the distance. But that also was seen as too much government control and limitation of the media. So by the second Iraq War and Afghanistan after 9/11, I think we hit a sweet spot called embedding. What embedding means is that anyone in the military, anyone in the press who wants to report on the war can do so in a pretty unlimited way. But the catch is they have to embed with a unit and go through basic training and deployment with that unit. So it requires a whole lot of dedication to the cause as a reporter, and it ensures that the reporters have a very nuanced understanding of what the operations are and are somewhat sympathetic to their now friends and brothers and sisters who are a part of their unit. So it gives them an inordinate amount of access, but also ensures that they are nuanced and in some way sympathetic to this perspective of the military. Okay, so, oh great, I'm glad you found it, Jana. That just reassures me that it's easily available. Okay, so take your time on the multiple choice. On the FRQs, you need to read every word, like spend a good 5 minutes just reading the question and making sure you understand what the question is asking. Every word is there for a reason, okay? Remember in the case comparison, the facts of the case that have led to a different holding, for the case you don't know, the facts of the case are provided, and there's a hint in there about how that case is factually different than the one you have to know, okay? So be sure you look for that within the question. Do not use pronouns in your answer in the FRQs. Do not use they or their. Also, be sure if you're talking about elections that you state primary elections or general elections. Also, no pronouns. Clarify what elections you're talking about. I think that's about it. Remember your argument of essay. Do not label anything in it. Okay. And if you'll go to Google Classroom and just look at the things I've posted there, SCOTUS reviews, foundational documents are posted there, as well as a breakdown of each FRQ. I think this will really help you. But do not sacrifice sleep. Okay, sleep is the most important thing for you to get tonight. So I think that's it. I've got to sign off. I got to go lead a meeting for my students going to China, so I don't want to be late to that. Good luck tomorrow. And you can't talk to me about the test afterwards. So we have to follow the testing code of ethics. Please don't tell me about the test. I will be able to see it when they release it, just like a month after it's graded or right before scoring. Okay? Alrighty, well, good luck. And those of you I have this spring, I'll see you on Tuesday, and we'll start deciding what our schedule is going to be for the rest of the semester. And for those of you I'm not teaching this semester, best of luck. You got this. And all of you, best of luck. You got this. I have a lot of faith in you all to do well. I'll talk to you later.